A few weeks ago, Supergirl, at one time one of the centerpieces of the CW's franchise of live-action DC Comics adaptations, aired its final episode. Despite a few creative ups and downs, the show had a more than respectable 6-year, 126-episode run, and was able to leave its own unique stamp on some of the most recognizable and enduring characters in the history of superhero comics. I was a fan of the show when it started. I was a fan when it ended, so now that it's flown off into the sunset, let's take a look back at the past 6 seasons of Supergirl. Co-created by Greg Berlanti, who by that point had also co-created the series Arrow and The Flash, along with Ali Adler and Andrew Kreisberg, Supergirl debuted on CBS in the fall of 2015. However, because it was neither a crime procedural nor a jokeless multi-camera sitcom, its run on CBS only lasted 1 season. Fortunately, it was picked up by the CW, which is where it really should have been the entire time. I mean, what was a superhero show doing on CBS? Sure, a crossover with The Price is Right would have been nice. All due respect to Henry Czerny, Drew Carey would have made a great toy man. I'm just saying. But, alas, it was not to be. So Supergirl moved to the CW, where the show assumed its rightful place as a cornerstone of the Arrowverse. Most of you watching this are probably already familiar with the Arrowverse, at least to some extent, even if you don't faithfully watch every episode of every show. And if you don't, no worries, because I don't either. But just in case you aren't familiar with it, try to imagine a combination of Silver Age DC Comics, 1990s teen drama, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, only without the budget. That'll give you a vague idea of the typical vibe of the franchise. The Arrowverse is named after Arrow, the live-action Green Arrow series that started it, and for better and for worse, set the template to which most of the shows that followed would adhere. After Arrow came The Flash, which took that template and lightened it up significantly, setting the tone for the rest of the franchise. When Supergirl came along as the 3rd show in the franchise, it followed the patterns that had been established by its 2 predecessors, especially once it jumped from CBS to the CW. At the center of the show was Supergirl herself, aka Kara Danvers, and surrounding her, just like Arrow and The Flash, was a group of allies, a support team, a Scooby Gang, if you will. Oh yes, I forgot one other crucial ancestor of the Arrowverse, the show that in large measure built what is now the CW, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And there's definitely a lot of Buffy in Supergirl, among other things. So, let's talk nuts and bolts. Supergirl is set in National City, where our hero, Kara Danvers, lives and works at Catco, a media company owned by former Daily Planet columnist Cat Grant. Cat isn't the only character to be imported from Superman's supporting cast. Jimmy Olsen also works for Catco, though this version of Jimmy is older and has moved up from photographer to art director. Kara is, as most comic fans know, Superman's cousin. Like baby Kal-El, she was also placed in a rocket and launched into space just prior to the destruction of their home planet Krypton. The plan was for Kara, who was a teenager when Krypton exploded, to follow Kal-El to Earth and look after him. But an accidental detour through the Phantom Zone meant that Kara's rocket didn't arrive on Earth until many years later, by which time Kal-El had already grown up and become Superman. When the series begins, Kara is working as Cat Grant's assistant at Catco, keeping her identity as a Kryptonian and Superman's cousin a secret from everyone except Superman himself and her adopted family, and not operating as a superhero on any level. That all changes when a plane carrying her adopted sister is about to crash, and Kara flies to the rescue, using her superpowers to land the plane safely, introducing herself soon after as Supergirl, a name given to her by Cat Grant, which Kara isn't, forgive me, super fond of at first. It turns out Kara's not the only one with a secret. Her sister Alex soon reveals that she is an agent of the Department of Extranormal Operations, the DEO, a government agency charged with protecting the public against the threats of rogue superhumans and aliens, of which there are quite a few throughout the run of this series. Oh, and Alex's boss at the DEO, Hank Henshaw, turns out to secretly be the Martian Manhunter. People with secret identities attract people with secret identities, I guess. That actually turns out to be one of the, I think, unintentional themes of the show. As the series goes on, it falls ever more readily into comfortable patterns, one of which is something we might call, screw it, everyone's a superhero. It starts in season 1 with the revelation that Henshaw is actually Martian Manhunter, continues in season 2 when Jimmy Olsen adopts the crime-fighting identity of the Guardian, and just keeps going from there. Tech guy Wynn eventually leaves for the 31st century to join the Legion of Superheroes. Kara's second season love interest, Mon-El, is a Daxamite with similar abilities to those of a Kryptonian, who also eventually travels to the 31st century to join the Legion. Kat's replacement as head of Catco, Andrea Rojas, is actually teleporting assassin Akrata. Lena Luthor eventually discovers a knack for witchcraft that enables her to join in the superhero shenanigans. Rookie reporter Nia Nal, who joins the show in season 4, becomes the psychic superhero dreamer halfway through the season. Alex's girlfriend, Kelly Olsen, Jimmy's younger sister, eventually succeeds her brother as Guardian. Even Alex's gig as an ass-kicking secret agent isn't good enough, as she eventually trades up to a full-fledged superhero identity as Sentinel. And you might think, well, it's a superhero show. What's the big deal about having so many characters who are superheroes? But imagine, say, a show about a doctor that starts out with a supporting cast that includes characters who don't work in the medical field, family, friends, or neighbors of the main character, and by the end of the series, all of those characters have decided to become doctors, and everyone works together at the same hospital. That's how Supergirl feels sometimes. It's not so much that it has lots of superhero characters because it's a superhero show, but more so that whenever the writers run out of ideas for a character, their solution is always the same. Make that character a superhero. So that becomes an accidental theme of the show, but there are plenty of intentional themes too. One that comes up again and again, and more frequently as the show goes on, is the question of how to be a good ally. And that's a smart choice, both in terms of story and in terms of the cultural space the series seeks to occupy. The show often exhibits some fairly progressive politics, but it's still centered on a young, conventionally attractive, upwardly mobile white woman with literal superpowers. To keep this from becoming too much of a problem, the show often goes to great pains to acknowledge Kara's relative privilege and make that a part of the story. And that's not to say the show always does a good job with it. When the message is one of women's empowerment, for example, it all too often comes across as the sort of shallow, condescending girl power feminism that was also a prominent feature of its aforementioned ancestor, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And sometimes, when someone is processing trauma or discovering the right way for a privileged person to support someone from a marginalized community or learning how to respect someone else's boundaries, the characters talk to each other as though they're conducting scripted therapy exercises rather than having actual conversations, which can cause obviously well-intentioned scenes to come across as calculated and insincere. On the other hand, at least they make the effort. I'll take a politically aware, socially conscious show that clumsily argues for equality and empathy and progress over a show that doesn't even try to say anything important every single time. Identity is another big theme. Figuring out who you are or who you want to be, and then figuring out how to be who you want to be. Almost every character in the show, hero and villain, struggles with this at one point or another. And that's not a criticism. Some of the show's best stuff comes from showing us its characters grappling with issues related to identity. There's a reason this theme has been so frequently explored by art in all media for centuries. It's a rich and often rewarding source of drama and insight, and due to the nature of the show and the various genres it's able to visit throughout the course of its run, Supergirl has the opportunity to explore this theme in a number of different ways. Jimmy's character arc, especially early on, is about establishing a life of his own, away from Metropolis, out of the shadow of his pal Superman. Wynn turns out to be the son of a supervillain, the not played by Drew Carey Toyman, as a matter of fact, and worries about having to live that down, as well as growing into his new responsibilities once he leaves his job at Catco to work full-time for the DEO. For two characters, exploring their identities often centers on their sexuality and gender identity. Nia, who eventually adopts the superhero guise of Dreamer, is trans and has to deal with multiple challenges related to that, including one from her own sister. And Alex comes out as gay fairly early on in the series, and though she finds what looks to be a good long-term relationship with Kelly eventually, she also discovers that living openly as herself doesn't make it any easier to balance her personal life with her hero responsibilities, even when her girlfriend becomes a superhero too, which, as I noted before, is a thing that happens. The difficulty of finding balance is another theme that runs through the series from beginning to end. Not just finding that balance between the personal and the professional, or the private and the public, but between our duties and our desires. One of the most painful realizations that most of us have to have at some point in our lives is that we can't have everything we want. So much of life, even when things are going good, is learning to let go. The character that the show uses most often and most effectively to explore this particular theme is Supergirl herself. Where Kara Danvers ends and where Supergirl begins, figuring out where that line should be drawn, is the central conflict of her character from the very first episode. It's a conflict she doesn't definitively resolve until the final episode. Of course, just because that is the protagonist's central conflict doesn't mean it's her only conflict. There are lots more, many of which are decidedly external. Supergirl ran for 6 seasons and 126 episodes, and contained within all those hours of television are quite a few supervillains, including takes on some of the most iconic villains in all of superhero comics. The series gives us its own versions of Parasite, Metallo, Bizarro, Livewire, and one of my personal favorites, Mr. Mxyzptlk, who's played by this guy in his initial appearances, then subsequently recast with Thomas Lennon, who is a major upgrade and perfect Mixie casting. But the most important recurring antagonist in the show eventually turns out to be its version of arguably the foremost of all supervillains, Lex Luthor. Lex doesn't actually appear on screen until the latter half of the show's 4th season, which is pretty late in the run. Before that, Lex is frequently mentioned but never actually seen. The series did that sort of thing a lot in its earlier seasons, and I'm not sure if it was a creative choice by the producers or a limitation imposed on them by the studio. Maybe a little from column A and a little from column B, but we get Lex's mother Lillian and his sister Lena as recurring characters before Lex himself finally shows up. The show played a similar game of hide-and-seek with Superman before he was introduced as an on-screen character in Season 2. We'd see him in silhouette, or see Kara reading a text message from him. To establish that he exists, it's just that we don't get to see him. I assumed the producers of Supergirl weren't allowed to have their own Superman because the grand poobahs at DC Entertainment were worried that it would take away from their movie version of Superman, who had just been introduced 2 years before the Supergirl series premiered. And if that was the case, the grand poobahs at DC Entertainment were right, because as soon as Superman arrived as an on-screen character on Supergirl's show, that version of the character made the shortcomings of his cinematic counterpart even more glaring than they already were. In fact, for all its shortcomings, the Arrowverse in general can be read as a retort to the grim, joyless, and preposterously self-serious centerpiece films of the DC Extended Universe, a collection of bright, clever, inviting, occasionally cheesy reminders that, when they aren't being made for a target audience of violent psychopaths, movies and TV shows based on DC comics can be fun too. But my enmity for the DCEU, which still burns in my veins like red-hot magma after all these years of flowing and ever-present rage, which I know now will never fully leave me, has led me to stray from the point. When Lex Luthor finally does appear as an on-screen character relatively late in Supergirl's run, he proves worth the wait. The Arrowverse version of Lex, played by John Cryer, who played Lex's nephew Lenny in the movie Superman 4: The Quest for Peace, isn't that neat? Deserves to stand alongside the other great live-action Lexes of the past. Gene Hackman's Lex from the Superman movies, John Shea's Lex from Lois and Clark, Michael Rosenbaum's Lex from Smallville, Not You. Cryer's Lex has elements of all of those: Hackman's smug superiority, Shea's confident charm, Rosenbaum's urge to prove himself, along with a few fresh ingredients of his own. Cryer's Lex is a schemer, a weasel, a bastard who revels in what a bastard he is. He's casually cruel, he's vindictive, he's outrageously petty. Early in Season 6, he's embroiled with his sister Lena in a power struggle over control of Luthor Corp, and when he realizes Lena has redirected some of his money to fund a new children's hospital, he burns down the hospital. It's one of my favorite moments in the entire series, a wonderfully warped and darkly hilarious example of the sort of over-the-top cartoon evil repped by this version of Lex. Lex's ability to switch back and forth from menacing to buffoonish parallels the wild swings in tone of the show itself. The series goes from painfully earnest to unabashedly goofy, often within the same episode. Its willingness to embrace the sillier side of its source material, something the early films of the DCEU were absolutely terrified of doing, means that by the end of the series, the world of Supergirl is pretty weird. Kara and John are far from the only aliens on planet Earth, a storyline in Season 4 that has our heroes battling a gang of xenophobic terrorists intent on driving away all aliens, a sadly evergreen allegory for the prejudice faced by immigrants and refugees, establishes that Earth has a very large, very visible extraterrestrial population. There are times, especially when Kara and her friends are hanging out in a bar surrounded by aliens, that it feels more like a Star Trek show than an adaptation of a DC comic. And hey, I'm just fine with that. Those touches of silliness and sci-fi fantasy help to distract from how formulaic the show can be. Like I said before, Supergirl, especially once it jumps to the CW after the first season, mostly follows the template established by Arrow and The Flash. That means the show is centered on a hero, Supergirl in this case, who is backed up by a support team, initially her sister, Secret Agent Alex, tech guy Wynn, friend and fellow crime fighter Jimmy Olsen / Guardian, and John / Martian Manhunter as the mentor figure. By the end of the series, the hero and support team model is still in place, but now the team includes Brainiac 5 from the 31st century, who replaces Wynn as the tech guy, Dreamer, who can use her dreams to tell the future, Astral Project, and also make weapons out of dream energy, Kelly Olsen, who replaces her brother Jimmy on the team as Guardian, and Lena Luthor, who in the show's final season becomes a powerful witch. So, yeah, it gets kind of bonkers, which, again, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It would be weird if a show about a team of superpowered people fighting to protect the planet from evil aliens didn't acknowledge how ludicrous it was. Wouldn't it? The series had its ups and downs through the years, to be sure. There are a couple of stretches in seasons 2 and 3 where it seems to be turning into the Mon-El show, an odd look for a show that frequently wears its feminism on its sleeve. Sometimes the goofiness is a little too goofy. Sometimes the earnestness is a little too painfully earnest. But the show is also socially conscious, uses its platform to at least try and say something meaningful about important issues, and showcases a talented and diverse cast of regulars and recurring characters that includes numerous women, people of color, and in the case of Dreamer, TV's first openly trans superhero, played by an openly trans actor, Nicole Maines, who is excellent. So overall, the show manages to hold it together through 6 seasons and ultimately stick the landing, more or less, and a ton of the credit for that goes to the lead character, Supergirl herself, and the actor who plays her. Before being cast as Supergirl, Melissa Benoist was best known for playing Marley in Glee, but since I never watched Glee, I'd never seen Melissa Benoist before I watched the first episode of Supergirl. But she impressed me then, and she has rarely failed to impress me since. Kara is a deceptively tricky role for an actor. At the start of the series, she has to be naive and inexperienced, but able to project strength and confidence toward her adversaries. But then, as the series goes on and she grows into her role as a superhero, she has to have a certain authority about her, a credibility suitable to a leader and a champion. But she also has to show the capacity to admit mistakes and learn and change. She spends the series struggling to find a way to live fully as herself, to be both Kara and Supergirl. It's her character's central conflict, as I said, but she also has to learn how to be a hero, when to rush in to save the day and when to hold back and give people the chance to save themselves. She learns how to wield her power responsibly, how important it is for people with power to be worthy of the public's trust, and which people and whose needs and interests she needs to consider when she uses her power. Kara has doubts, she has insecurities, she wonders about her place in the superhero pantheon, if she even deserves one. She's proud to be Superman's cousin, but she wants to be more than that. She wants to honor her family, but she also wants to chart her own course. Once we meet this show's version of Superman, who, as played by Tyler Hoechlin, is damn near perfect, one of the most impressive live-action versions of the character ever, we see just how much Kara has to live up to. And it's a lot. But Kara does live up to it. And Melissa Benoist rises to the challenge of playing the character and the challenge of carrying this series. She's charming, likable, admirable, inspiring, everything a superhero should be. Her character evolves throughout the series, but Benoist manages to find a stable core, an essence of the character that makes her who she is, so Kara never feels remote or like a cipher. And in the end, she finds just the right notes of courage and determination to show us Kara finally resolving that central conflict between her private life and her life as Supergirl. That conflict ends the only way it can, really, in a way that feels true to the character and true to the series. After having saved the world yet again, Kara is at her sister's wedding, surrounded by her friends, and after back-to-back pep talks from Cat Grant and Lena Luthor, she realizes that the only way to balance Kara Danvers and Supergirl is to stop pretending that they're two people. She's not two people. She's one person. So she takes off her glasses, which, like with her cousin Clark, are the key to her civilian disguise, sets them down, and goes to join her friends. As Kara, as Supergirl, as herself. After spending 6 years encouraging her friends to embrace their truths, to have the courage to live as who they really are, Kara realizes that the only way forward is for her to do the same thing. So in the closing moments of the series, She pulls an Iron Man and reveals to the world that she, Kara Danvers, is Supergirl. It's a perfect endpoint for the show, one that feels simultaneously brave and inevitable. It's Kara taking a bold step, moving into a new and uncertain phase of her life, a phase we won't get to see because the show's over, but which feels exciting and filled with promise. A risk, yes, but a risk worth taking. It's an ending that brings home what makes Supergirl great, as a character and as a show. Because in the final analysis, the show isn't about good guys fighting bad guys. It's not about who's stronger than whom or who has what superpowers or what diabolical plot for personal enrichment and or world domination Lex has cooked up this time. It's about figuring out who you are and how to live as that person. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell us how. We have to find it out for ourselves, and that's not easy. Even for superheroes.